You are considering getting into the hardest content Final Fantasy XIV has to offer, but you are not entirely sure where to start. So much so in fact that you're not even sure what job to bring to the occasion. If this is true, then this video is absolutely for you. You may also just want some insight into what jobs are a bit milder to start with, out of curiosity. Now then, naturally, if you like a specific job very much in particular, then that may just be the perfect job for extremes, savage, and ultimates for you. However, sometimes your favorite job is simply too difficult to play in the beginning in this much more brutal and demanding environment. For example, if you want to play Black Mage but also find dealing with complex boss mechanics difficult, causing you to completely halt your attack while dealing with them, then Black Mage may not be the best choice to start. You can play a different mage with more easily accessible mobility while still collecting caster gear that you can use for your Black Mage later down the line when you have gotten more experienced. As such, the intent of this guide is to lead you to the easier starter jobs to get you a milder start, and who knows, maybe you decide to stick with this job once you get started. Of course, mastering a specific boss encounter also includes mastering it for the job you are playing, which means that once you have gotten more experienced with dealing with complex boss mechanics while performing a complex rotation, switching over to a different job will require you to relearn the boss fight from the alternate perspective of whichever job you switch to. Like a Black Mage needing to know where to place their ley lines, or when to save their triple casts, and so on. Now, we will go through the suggested jobs with the easier roles first and the harder roles last, beginning, maybe not surprisingly, with mages. Summoner is by far one of, if not the easiest job to play in Final Fantasy XIV. In a 1 minute period, Summoner will be forced to stand still to cast for at most around 10 seconds, but typically less. The job also has a raise spell to assist the team, and adds some planning considerations as, while using swift cast for attacking gives you even more mobility, and sometimes a small damage gain. If you needed it for a raise, then you can't waste it for a tiny damage gain. Summoner also has a raid buff, and the rotation gives enough freedom that a key point to master is planning when you use Ifrit, as it is your least mobile phase in the job's rotation. Having a raid buff to manage gives you some more direct insight into how other jobs play around raid buffs, and depending on how much experience you have with hard content, you may have very little knowledge or understanding of this specific concept. Energy Drain and Festa also serves as a simple example of resource stockpiling, also a key optimization trick to make the most of the raid buffs. Summoner has just a little bit of everything, just enough to give you a taste of all of the small tricks players use to optimize and maximize their damage when pushing it to the limit, but not so much as to overwhelm the player. Summoner's toolkit is simple enough that most of these tools simply slot in where they need to be without needing to keep a huge overview over where you are in your rotation. In terms of capability to switch to a different job once you have gained some experience, Summoner happens to be very indifferent in terms of what gear to wear. Obviously, going for a lot of critical hit is a common strategy, and you don't need more spell speed than a GCD of around 2.47 to be consistent in your Bahamut and Phoenix phases. But Summoner is equally capable of using a heavy spell speed build with some direct hit. In other words, if you actually want to play Red Mage, you can make a Red Mage build with little to no spell speed to pivot to once you feel comfortable switching. And similarly, you can make a heavy spell speed build, excellent for Black Mage, to pivot to. While Red Mage is also a somewhat easy starter job, the fact that Summoner has a little bit of everything, and so much mobility, and is very open in regards to gear, gives you the largest amount of choice if you decide to switch to a different job down the line. The biggest downside to Summoner in Savage content is that if you are playing using Party Finder, the job happens to be very popular, so it may not always be easy to find groups that don't already have a Summoner in the group specifically. This is, probably not too surprisingly, possibly a recurring issue for the jobs recommended in this guide. The second job will be the ranged physical representative, Dancer. With a toolkit that is entirely mobile, you will not need to worry nearly as much about finding safe spots to start casting from. However, as Dancer is more of a support job, managing your raid buffs and partner buffs is a lot more important. An advantage to Dancer is also that as the job is a lot less focused on its own DPS, as long as your raid buffs come out on time, your personal performance is not as heavily weighed, although it is still crucially important to play as best as you can, of course. Dancer also has a significantly more complex opener than Summoner, with a lot more button presses in every burst sequence. However, for the most part, it boils down to clicking cooldowns when they come up, and knowing what takes priority if two things come up at the same time. Dancer also has a much heavier focus on resource stockpiling, with both Feathers and Esprit gauge being important to carry over into burst windows. Gear-wise, all three ranged physical DPS happen to want almost exactly the same thing, with Machinist wanting as close to 0 skill speed as possible, and Bard and Dancer preferring to hang out around 2.48 and 2.47. This is mainly because each of these jobs have a large amount of tools that have almost detrimental interactions with having skill speed, or otherwise not really benefiting from it. As such, in terms of gearing, all three jobs in this role can get away with using mostly the same. As Dancer has a handful of defensive tools useful for the raid, it means you will also be more intimately acquainted with the fight's mechanics, as your tools specifically may be needed more compared to Summoner's Adel. The main downside of Dancer in terms of learning is that it is very random in its rotation in general, which may make it a lot more difficult to get used to a specific encounter, both in terms of the fight itself and in terms of planning your rotation around it. For the final DPS job, Reaper will be the melee DPS option. An unfortunate disadvantage of playing melee DPS is that each of them at most share armor with one of the other melee DPS, with Ninja sharing with no one, and in fact sharing their accessories with the ranged physical section. As such, if you intend to play Ninja specifically at the end of the day, or a striking melee DPS, it may be wiser to start with one of those, even if it may give you a slightly more difficult start. For striking, I would recommend Samurai, as I do believe it is significantly easier than Monk, although Samurai isn't the easiest either. Reapers have access to two different openers depending on what the fight calls for. These openers are both slightly adjusted depending on your skill speed, with Reaper being the kind of job that doesn't really want any skill speed. Which is just as well, for Dragoon, the job it shares armor with, also doesn't care much for skill speed. As a melee, you may sometimes have to be more careful about positioning, as you want to keep your GCD rolling while moving away when necessary during boss fights. However, at least in more recent content, it is more common that melee DPS can reliably keep their GCD rolling perfectly fine while dealing with mechanics. Reaper's rotation revolves much less around a lot of burst phases, and more about managing and using cooldowns where they fit, while managing the debuff Death's design. The 2-minute burst relies on you having a somewhat specific amount of resources when it comes up, which may require you to know whether you need to vent resources quite a while in advance, which itself is also a skill worth learning, although the jobs that have this kind of property are somewhat limited. The best part about Reaper as a starting job for difficult content is that the rotation is sort of slow and predictable, so you don't have to focus too much on it. And the burst isn't that high paced either, with only one thing that you really need to keep watch for to know when to begin the burst, namely around 8 to 9 seconds left on the Arcane Circle cooldown. The reason why learning when to vent resources becomes a crucial skill to learn as Reaper is because some bosses may have significant amounts of downtime. So if you vent at the wrong time, you will be missing the resources you actually need for your 2-minute burst when it comes around. So you will be learning when you can and when you can't get away with doing an extra in Shroud. Overall, this means that Reaper is a very flexible job, while still being strict and predictable enough that you can plan a fight around it. For gearing, as most of the melee jobs don't care particularly much about skill speed, with Monk weirdly standing out a bit here, you can probably use many of the same accessories for any not ninja melee job if you like. For the easy to start tank, Paladin has the most straightforward toolkit as well as the simplest rotation. Additionally, Paladin is the only tank that can keep up at least some of its rotation while quickly repositioning a boss, or needing to stay at a distance, due to the spells in the rotation. Compared to the other tanks, Paladin has no need for late weaving, whereas Warrior wants to not only late weave its signature defensive tool Bloodwetting, but also time it with an incoming tank buster. Paladin also does not have a very significant amount of resource stockpiling, of which both Dark Knight and Gunbreaker has plenty. From any position, the Paladin can be completely prepared to burst immediately and within 10 seconds can have prepared anything they might feasibly want to prepare. As the Paladin rotation is extremely straightforward and the burst itself is mostly concentrated in the 1-minute cooldowns themselves, you can focus on the boss fight itself and managing your defensive cooldowns, giving you as much breathing room as possible. Unique among the tanks, the Paladin is also the only one that can stockpile 2 of its signature Holy Sheltron, meaning that you can much more aggressively use this, while still keeping an extra use for emergencies or tank busters. The Paladin uniquely having a passive block chance also helps immensely for your passive damage reduction. The main downsides of Paladin relate to gearing and flexibility in terms of self-preservation. Warrior, Dark Knight and Gunbreaker all have each their own preference in skill speed, but function somewhat decently at any value, with Gunbreaker being the most inconvenienced by 0 skill speed. Paladin, on the other hand, is inconvenienced by almost any amount of skill speed, at least mildly so. The fact that about a third of the Paladin's attacks will be spells that are unaffected by skill speed entirely does not help either. For the self-preservation, both Gunbreaker and Warrior have far better healing options than Paladin and are much more flexible in their uses, as they are connected with defensive options in their kits, whereas the Paladin's strongest self-healing that isn't a DPS loss, Clemency, is directly related to your attack rotation itself, meaning that often this healing will come up at times where you don't actually need it. Aside from this, you have Divine Veil and Holy Sheltron's passive healing. However, if you are learning as a tank, it may be easier to work with a tank that has a heavier focus on minimizing damage you take, so you can focus on this rather than splitting up your focus on also healing yourself. And we can probably all agree that healers would be the hardest jobs to start Savage raiding with. In particularly hard content, barrier healers tend to be significantly harder to play, because it is a lot more likely that they simply run out of tools to use without a lot of planning ahead. And these healers tend to deal very poorly with healing without their cooldowns. Additionally, Astrologian has a very complex card management section of its rotation that makes it very difficult to start with as well. This leaves White Mage. I introduced a job like this because I want to underline that White Mage isn't easy either, it just happens to be easier to learn with in Savage content. White Mage's defensive toolkit is almost entirely single-minded in its approach, with nearly no options to outright prevent damage, but almost every single conceivable way of saying heal a lot you could imagine being present. This means that aside from Temperance, Aquaveil and a couple Divine Benisons, you are entirely at the mercy of the rest of the raid for actual damage reduction when needed. However, even when every single cooldown is spent, you still have Medica 2, which is immensely powerful for raid healing, so you're never completely out of options. The sheer amount of cooldowns you have access to also means that you may find it difficult to find reasons to use them all up before something else becomes available again. Now, White Mage is what could be considered, and now you may need to put down that glass of water for this one, a selfish healer. I know. It sounds ridiculous, but as White Mage provides no damage boosting raid buffs at all whatsoever, the damage you provide for your raid is entirely down to how many GCDs you manage to fire off, and how many Azizes you manage to use. Which also means that as you become better at White Mage, that presence of mind should move from even being considered as a panic button to be the big damage button. And similarly, the lilies happen to do healing, but the main purpose of them moves over to allow you to plan those blood lilies the most efficiently during raid cooldowns whenever possible. White Mage has the weakest MP recovery amongst the healers, and paired with presence of mind increasing your MP spending further, it is possible that you will feel a severe lack of MP more often with this healer compared to the other healers. This means that should you switch to a different healer, you will immediately feel like you suddenly have too much piety, probably. However, for the most part, all of the healers sort of agree on what stats they want, so this can often be resolved over time as you get more gear. So to summarize the 5 recommended starter jobs, 1 for each role. Summoner is an excellent starter because it does a little bit of everything you want to master as a DPS, and is flexible enough in its gear that you can pivot to either of the other mages quite easily if you wish. Dancer has a very heavy focus on raid cooldown management, as your value in your party is greatly determined by how well your cooldowns line up with everyone else's cooldowns, especially your dance partners. Dancer also offers a good way to practice resource stockpiling and dealing with random rotations, although Dancer itself also happens to have the most random rotation. Reaper is the most mellow of all the melee DPS, giving you the time you need to think ahead and planning your rotation around boss mechanics, which is particularly important when boss mechanics can force you away. Reaper having a very easy to keep track of 2-minute burst queue is also very helpful for learning this aspect for jobs that don't have a consistent odd-minute burst to keep time. Paladin serves as the most damage reduction focused of the 4 tanks, and also happens to have an extremely simple rotation, letting you focus on the tank-centric mechanics in the fight. And similarly, White Mage is the most raw healing focused of the healers, allowing you to focus on that aspect at first. Although, later down the line, you will probably have to learn how to manage anything you have in your toolkit that can increase your damage too, which is also an excellent skill to master for any healer really. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. If you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel. Fun fact, tank busters and raid-wide attacks with an attached damage over time component are more and more common in Savage content. The total damage of the dot component of such a mechanic is actually determined when the initial hit lands. So using defensive cooldowns that reduces the damage taken after the dot is applied actually doesn't help. It is important to use defensive cooldowns for the initial hit and not save them for the dot when it is already too late.